Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you to those who've been here since 11. It's been a long day. Thank you, Dominic, for being here.
Thank you.
Dominic is a Dominican friar and theologian and composer, and a co-founder of the Friends of Sophia, and soon the director of the new, soon-to-be-open Centre for Theology and Art at Blackfriars in Oxford. And I invited you to come to do a bit of theology around the mystics. We've had an afternoon packed with mystics. Hadovich, Hildegard, Teresa, Catherine. Am I missing? Do we talk of any other mystics this afternoon? I think some other mystics popped during the afternoon. And I've also been interested, obsessed, maybe not the right word, but in the mystics lately, particularly. I have a Catholic background, and I was brought up a Catholic. So Teresa of Avila has always been, and I'm Spanish, so she's been a big part of sort of my growing up, and the Carmelite sort of spirit's been very much, but in my upbringing, but. In my research, academic research, in performance art, I came across Simone Weil, and she drew me back into the mystics, and I started reading the mystics through a different perspective. And so I hope we can talk a bit about what the mystical experience is, and what the mystic from a Christian sort of tradition. So the word mystic wasn't really used until quite recently, when it started more sort of in the Enlightenment, when they started to dissect, map out everything. They started talking about the mystics, but the mystic tradition was very much part of our Judeo-Christian sort of. Correct me here, because I'm not the theologian, so you can stop me whenever, or anyone else can stop me if I'm saying something that I shouldn't say. But we have it in the Songs of Songs in the Old Testament. So there is a tradition that's been there, and then Bernard de Clairvaux, who's the 11th century, 12th Cistercian, started to write more in this more effective. Personal sort of relationship with Christ as the groom, and the soul being the bride. So that's sort of the beginning of what we can call mystical theology. So we can talk about that, but now, yes, we are going to talk about it. We are talking about it. I just would like to, I'm going to ask you what you understand as a theologian as the mystic experience, but I'd like to go back to the word mystic, which comes from mu, from the word, a Hebrew version of the Greek mu, which is was the root that gives name and origin to the mysticism, mystery, muteness, music, but also mud and midst, that all insinuate the ungraspable. Something outside logic or reason, a mystery that cannot be grasped. I sort of feel attracted to this other way of being, that is the mystic. A consent not to be an isolated property holder, possessive individual. A consent not to entirely be modern. I've approached the mystics to get a taste of another way of being otherwise in the world, pre-modern, pre-Cartesian, pre-industrial way of being and relating, in the sharing and in the gathering, in the openness. I recently came across, actually not recently, by the end of my research, I was quite attracted to those words from the Black theorist and poet and scholar Fred Moten. He wrote a few of his essays that sort of use certain terms that I resonated with me. In Blackness and Nothingness from 2013, he wrote about blackness being the deprivation of the white Western world still entangled in image and subject formation. And he urges to pay attention to a black mystical nothingness, so I was quoting, in which we are left with a kind of poetic access to what it, and this is a quote, a kind of poetic access to what is of the other world that remains unheard, unnoticed, unrecognized in this one. And I think that sort of sets a bit, we're not going to try to scientifically identify what is a mystical experience. We don't want to. I don't want to objectify, dissect what it is, but it's always, I think, this poetic access. It's this poetic, innocent, humble, and poor. That's also a word that Fred Merton sort of picks up on. Poor and open approach to what is the mystic experience. Yesterday we spoke about darkness of the soul, which was an experience of dryness, of nothingness in John of the Cross, which we might relate to this, blackness. We spoke about the mystics not owning or dispossessed of their selves, which reminded me on my way back home of St. Paul in his letters to the Corinthians. I don't know which one, but the as not. So to be as not, or to be in the world as not. And so it's sort of to be in our body, to live in the body as not. So I thought I'd stick to those. So that's sort of to introduce a bit our conversation. I mean, the idea was initially to talk about the body, how the mystics would understand their body. So we're looking very much at the medieval or early modern mystic. We'll leave Simone Weil for another time. And to talk about how they would understand their body. And then, obviously, through understanding of our bodies, we are in the world differently. So the gesturing and dance as a mode of being in the world in our body. So the body, the gesture and dance. And also the mystic as never as a dancing solo, but really open to others. And because you're Dominic and you're a Dominican, you know, we can speak of Catherine of Siena, as you know, to talk about. We can hold on to her to think through these questions, and I'm not a specialist. Maybe Harry can help us with Teresa of Avila, but we can also ask her, Teresa, to help us through these questions. But over.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Teresa. It's obviously we did have we're not just two random people. We did have a conversation about our conversation before, but it's always exciting to do this in the light of what we saw today. I'm actually going to start, though, with yesterday in a very different context. I was responding to a seminar, and I was talking a bit about the French or Belgian filmmaker Agnès Varda. Anybody come across her? Faces, Places, The Gleaners. She's a lovely person, very warm, loves people, very good at getting people to talk about themselves on screen. So she's really the opposite of the auteur filmmaker in many ways. But she did say something which really jumped out at me, because I've long been interested in mysticism. I think it's somewhere in Faces, Places, she says, I'm not a mystic. I've got my feet on the ground, or in French, I'm in life. So for her perception of the mystic is somebody who's not really here, who's running away, who's on the escape rocket from this earth. And I think that there can be a certain kind of mysticism which is seen as self-centered, self-indulgent, neglectful of other. And I think that's a good criticism. It's a fair criticism of a filmmaker who just cares so much about other people and letting their stories be heard and their faces be seen. But then just a few weeks ago, I found about somebody else in the Carmelite tradition of Teresa of Avila, and I will come on to Catherine of Siena. I should do it a Dominican, really. So this is Mariam Bawadi, an Arab mystic, canonized just a couple of years ago by the late Pope Francis as St. Mary of Bethlehem, because she refounded a Carmelite monastery in the tradition of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, in Bethlehem. And Mariam was Palestinian from Haifa, born in the middle of the 19th century. And, oh, don't worry about the notes, I'm sure we don't need them. And she was a dancer. And there's a wonderful description where people asked her, because of her, to many people at the time, less to us as artists, but maybe to some of her community, bizarre behavior. One day they were in prayers, and they just finished prayer, and she rushed into the private house chapel and started dancing in front of the altar. And the other nuns were a bit taken aback by this. And when she'd sort of come out of this ecstasy, they said, what was going on? And she said, well, I found myself in a complete state of annihilation. It's a complete state of nothingness. Not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say, not knowing who I am. But it's not something, I found interesting, it's not something she deliberately cast herself into. It wasn't an escape. I mean, something I find more disturbing, quite honestly, is the Rudolf Laben's, next door to the Laben Centre, his collaborator Mary Wiegmann, with her Hexentanz, a witch's dance, where she quite deliberately throws herself into a state of escape, a frenzy, because she wants to get away from this world, which after all, this world which is often cruel to us. And we artists, we're sensitive people, something we have in common, I think, with the mystics. But Marianne Bawadi, Sister St. Mary of Bethlehem, said that I felt myself in a state of annihilation, and then I felt called to articulate all of creation's praise to God. So she's in a state of annihilation, but actually in a state of complete connection. Not just with others, but also with the whole of nature. I was very struck, say, by Christian's film on Hadderweich, if I'm pronouncing that properly. Thank you. I do know Louise Nelstrop, so she's very helpful. The way that she's being taken up, and then you get these extraordinary sort of almost brain burst moments of the colours, and yet she's in nature, she's touching things, she's connecting with everything. And then going to somebody like Catherine of Siena, I often think of Catherine as the inventor of personal space. Has anybody seen Catherine of Siena's house in Siena? So she's a 14th century Dominican mystic. So she grew up in a family of 20-odd children, plus the staff, because they had a home business. So she actually demanded her own room and got it. That must have been an achievement, about the age of 15. And she spent a lot of time on her own in the attic, and then when she was 18, experienced a mystical marriage to Christ. And then immediately this happens, Christ says, go out into the city, which of course women were not meant to wander around on their own. Or certainly not be preaching, which she did. She was with her group of the Mantellate, the veiled ones, these women, most of them were a lot older than her. And then she was doing extraordinary things, healing the sick. It's very bodily stuff. She was with a criminal when he was about to be executed, and she got him to repent and ask forgiveness for what he'd done. I'm very struck by this. This person who, as a mystic, with a very inner life, which maybe only art can represent. I mean, Catherine, there's a big debate whether she could read or write, but at least she must have had a scribe. She can narrate these very powerful inner experiences, but they all seem to be for the sake of others. And I mean, the way she told the Pope in no uncertain terms to leave Avignon and come back to Rome, she said, otherwise I will have to complain to the crucified Christ about you. And that seemed to have been enough, because the Pope, well, he didn't get on the train because there weren't trains, but, came back to Rome. So, yeah, I'm really struck by that, by the embodiment. And I was blown away by Mimi's piece this morning, that film of her giving birth and her daughter reading a Eucharistic prayer. That was, there is a part of me as traditionalist. I know how to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. I think it's amazing. I love all the silence in it where you can hear nature outside, and all that's gathered into the prayer. And I know people who, I don't think, if they heard about that, would think, that's really bad, shouldn't do that. But if you're there, I thought that was utterly beautiful. It blew me away. And again, so embodied.
Well, going back to the body, when you say the bride, I mean the mystical marriage. Can you explain what that means? Because you also said annihilation. I never say it properly. They are, so in the mystical experience, if you can not define it, but if you can, again through Catherine, help us understand, what that means. What's that? What's taken over? What's given up? What's given in that relation, in that moment?
Wow, that's
so. Maybe going to very concrete examples of Teresa, maybe through Teresa, for Catherine of Siena, maybe, or to.
It's hard. To be honest, it's hard for me to do so because I personally don't experience God in those terms. I can connect very much with somebody like St. Mary of Bethlehem, finding God in the cosmos. And I think it's not a coincidence that Marianne was a Melkite. So she was the Melkites are Arab Orthodox Christians in communion with Catholics, with Rome, and they are Byzantine by liturgical tradition. And the Byzantine tradition is very strong on the very New Testament notion of the new heaven and the new earth. So Christ didn't just save humankind. He saves, he heals, it's the same word in Greek, the whole of creation. I think Marianne really got that. So I'm actually, oddly enough, the English though I am, find myself more in that. I love Malcolm Guite, the Anglican poet, when he says God hides in everything. So I am constantly struck by the spiritual, the numinous, the extraordinary depth in everything. I hear the mystical marriage tradition coming much more through women mystics. I mean, there may be male mystics I haven't come across yet. Maybe St. Bernard approaches that. Maybe John of the Cross. It's not my personal experience, so I struggle. I honour it, and I don't want to appropriate it. But something, I think that it was in Harry's and Laura's piece earlier, you quoted Teresa about giving God our will. I mean, obviously none of us wants to be controlled, but it is maybe, there can be the bad will about, the distinction between being free for, so we were free to come and give today, or free from, I'm not going to come because that way I stay independent. But we showed up. Maybe it's a bit that really, that the paradox is when I hand my will to God, I don't become a robot, I at last become completely free. So Catherine could I see her life as performance art, really. I mean, going up on the scaffold with this criminal, and in a way identifying with him, like Jesus being crucified. And actually an amazing transformation happens, and he's set free. So I think maybe, I don't know, I don't feel, maybe you can say more about that, Teresa, I don't know. I do personally, I feel I would maybe traduce them by trying to express them, but I maybe it is in the handing over of the will so I can be free for. Maybe that's the best I can do. Sorry, that's not very good, is it? But
we can maybe approach it also, as you say, through dance and through the artistic experience. So, what is sort of that in rapture, you can say that in art or in dance, you can have this moment of letting go of your will, or sort of being in the other, or being so open that you lose something of yourself. So in dance, for instance, when you enter into sort of another state, and you are for the world, and you are for that moment and for the others. That could be something maybe similar to losing the self. Again, you don't lose yourself completely, and all these women mystics actually were quite present. I mean, they're still with us today. I mean, they kept trying to sort of hide, or not hide, but to withdraw the self, but then they were extremely present. So, and they were extremely present to others, and Catherine would also go and heal during the plague, right? Or Teresa of Avila for her nuns and going out and founding monasteries. So let's go back to the relation to the body. They had an intense relationship with the body. They lived the love of Christ through their bodies. They lived the suffering of Christ through their bodies. They were very embodied in a way. So if we can go try and understand how they understood the body, also theologically, because they were not Gnostics.
No.
They loved their body in a way that we can't really understand, because they didn't quite see a separation between the body and the soul. It was all one. They didn't understand the body as an object. This is pre-Kant, pre-Descartes. They had another understanding of living in the body. So can we talk maybe through maybe Thomas Aquinas' understanding of the body, but maybe going to what is agnostic? They were not Gnostic. They had an extreme love for the self at the same time as they were renouncing the self for God. So there was that's the paradox of the mystics, right? They were sort of in that paradox.
Yes.
So can you explain what the Gnostic controversy is and how it can still sort of be with us today, or
So the Gnostics, they're not. This has had many iterations, starting before Christianity. Of course, it literally means people with knowledge. And knowledge is important in Christianity too. Gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge, is a gift of the Holy Spirit. All that's in the New Testament. But the Gnostics, what seems to be common to the many different strands of writings and traditions which are come together as Gnostic, is a belief in salvation and healing through knowledge rather than faith. Again, many of us might have the experience that, for example, I've worked a lot with dancers, and the dancer might say, when I thought that was wonderful. It was just wonderful that moment. And the dancer said to me, I went to another place. Now, he knew that was true. There wasn't an act of faith, like you might make an act of faith in the doctrines of a religion. You receive the gift to believe, as a Christian, that God is three and God is one. But he knew that. That was his experience. But the Gnostics, it goes further than that really it's a body of knowledge which sets you free. But a body of knowledge which paradoxically sets you free from the body. So the goal of the spiritual life is to escape the body and to escape the material. Now, actually, St. Dominic, who founded the Dominicans, was the first to have a successful dialogue with the Cathars, who were sort of medieval Gnostics. And I think one of the things that Dominic did was, rather than just tell them they were wrong, and I do think it's a pretty miserable existence if you think that the body is evil and the world is bad and the only good thing is to try to escape. So, if people are ill, hurrah, let them die, don't make them better. But Dominic actually asked why. Well, these people were poor, they were sick, they were ruled by warlords, they were victims of injustice. The clergy, frankly, weren't much better because they were often from the ruling class. Well, it's quite reasonable you believe the world was evil and made by the devil, if that's what your life is like. So also very early on, one of the ways that Dominicans embodied Christianity was in working for social justice. Bartolomé de las Casas, whose writings about the indigenous people of the quote-unquote Indies, i.e. the Caribbean islands and Central and Southern America, they're still useful for knowing about those people and also how the conquistadores were oppressing them. But Las Casas was hated by a lot of white European governments right into the 20th century, which is probably why he hasn't really made it far up the ladder to sainthood yet. But he was a Dominican, and this was part of embodiment of justice. Now, we can all have bad moments with the body where we can feel our passions pushing us to do bad things. We can be tired of our bodies when we're ill. My poor mum now is getting old, and is always going to the doctor and always having hospital appointments. Her soul is still very free, but her body is breaking down. Let's be honest. But actually, Wittgenstein, philosopher who was sort of Christian, sort of Jewish Christian tradition, lots of conversations back and forth. He said, my body is how I am present to the world. And I think something you were telling me about, Teresa, is actually how the pre-modern idea of the body is not as how I am separate from the world, or even as just something I inhabit, like I might get into a car and drive it. But actually the body is porous. And neuroscience is telling us that now. You know, before I even come up to you, we're firing neurons at each other. And we might already get a sense of whether I'm friendly or whether I'm hostile. So my body is how I am present. And actually early Christian baptism, by immersion, by anointing with oil, is a very somatic experience. So I would say in sum that the somatic is the spiritual. And I mean, somebody like Hildegard that we heard performed earlier, I mean, Hildegard and her migraines, and yet that's where she has visions. They experience the spiritual in the body, and how else can we express it to others? By speech, by performance, often needing art because art goes beyond words. Sorry, is that a reason? I've wandered a bit. Is that a...
It brings me back to sort of how Hildegard and sort of this porosity of being, of how, you know, you're not quite shut in that skin as an envelope or as a wall that will shut you in that sort of private space of your body. But and I read recently this art historian Jack Hartnell who's worked on manuscripts, medieval manuscripts of medicine and science, and he was saying how the body, we think of our bodies, I'm quoting him, medieval bodies, we think of our bodies now as relatively closed and contented circuits, our skin as clear border between the inside and outside of ourselves. But the human form in the medieval period is considered a far more open and porous group of organs and systems. As a result, an understanding of the world circling around the body was crucial to understanding of what lies within. So there was sort of that sort of more dynamic sort of relation to the world, which is a being in the body in relation, constant relation with the world. We were talking earlier about, we have 5 minutes, but it's already 5 o'clock. Well, we can maybe just to finish. So we were talking earlier about sort of that incompleteness of the mystics, sort of always, and the hungry. Well, I used hunger yesterday, and the emptiness of being that is sort of thirsting and hungering for another, and sort of always open, sort of to, and that I kind of relate to the mystics of always in that sort of desire of union, and being in sort of in a state of unfinished.
Like Fred Moten.
Yeah,
yes,
and that sort of that puts you in that state of vulnerability and in a relation and with the world that is always sort of open, also in a state of vulnerability. But maybe we can leave it there because, you know, it's the end of the day. We're all a bit tired. We still. Oh well, that's it. Well, maybe we can finish. I had a bit of John of the. Well,
if rotten vegetables come our way, we know to stop.
But I think it's because although we can understand the mystical experience as radically personal, because it is a personal experience. I mean, they shared it with us through their writings, but it is it's uniquely theirs, that experience. As you said, you weren't even able to talk about the mystical experience because you have to sort of, if you haven't lived it, but on the other side there, it is an experience of being taken and being given the divine, right? It's a radical union with the divine that takes you radically outside yourself towards the other, and I think that's maybe a way of finishing this the conversation. There's lots of things that we could talk about, but I think we'll finish there. I would like to read, actually, just a bit of John of the Cross, because you mentioned, Mark, John of the Cross yesterday in the darkness. And I'll just read that, and then we can finish, if that's all right. I live, yet do not live in me. I'm waiting as my life goes by, and die because I do not die. No longer do I live in me, and without God I cannot live. To him or me I cannot give myself. So what can living be? 1,000 deaths my agony, waiting as my life goes by, dying because I do not die.